Mr Rudd has kept a low profile of late, but he agreed to appear on 7:30 tonight, as long as he could talk about a landmark summit in California this weekend between the US President Barack Obama and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, not just the internal strife in the Labor Party. We covered both subjects when Kevin Rudd joined me from Canberra earlier. Kevin Rudd, why is this two-day summit between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping so important?
I think there are two basic reasons. Number one is this. East Asia is becoming something like a global arms bazaar. And what we see is not just the concentration of armaments in the region, but also a whole range of security tensions between China and Japan, between China and the Philippines, between China and Vietnam, and of course across the Korean Peninsula too. The danger is, because we have strategic distrust between America and China, this means that the possibility of any of these incidents escalating out of control into conflict becomes greater. So we need a reset. But there's a second reason as well. With China, we're looking at a country which in the next decade or so will become the largest economy in the world. This will be the first time in a couple of hundred years that a non-Western, non-democratic, non-English speaking state will be the world's largest economy. So the challenge is this. Can we work with the Chinese to adhere to, strengthen, reform intelligently the international rules-based order which we've had since 1945? Or is it going to deteriorate to the extent that when China becomes powerful enough, it would seek unilaterally to change the rules of the order? So getting these two together, Obama and Xi Jinping, in a working level summit is so important to begin to reduce the strategic trust deficit.
One of the issues on the summit agenda is cybersecurity. That's been in the spotlight in Australia recently because of claims that Chinese hackers accessed the blueprint for the new ASIO headquarters. What incentive does China have to stop hacking?
Well, look, you're right to point to cybersecurity as a key tension in the relationship. In fact, it affects all countries, not just China and the United States. And so therefore, one of the recommendations I've put publicly in articles I've written in the United States is that the two leaders should commission their heads of their respective militaries, led by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the US side, to begin to work out rules of the road for cybersecurity. Now, these are very sensitive intelligence matters, but of course in the United States and elsewhere there is a real and rolling concern about commercial espionage. So China, because it also has its own developing intellectual property, has a big interest in protecting its own assets as well.
I want to ask you about China's economy, given the volatility we've seen in commodity prices. Can Australia continue to reliably rely on China's economy to fuel ours?
Yes, but in this sense, we cannot afford to put all of our eggs in one basket, namely the resources basket. China itself is changing its growth model, and this is the big agenda of Xi Jinping's administration. And therefore, what they are doing is moving to a new growth model, a change after the last 30 years, which is based on domestic consumption rather than labour-intensive manufactures for export. So therefore, for the China of the future, which is a massive economy, about to become the world's second largest, we need as Australia to be looking at across the range of new export opportunities, by which I mean agribusiness, food supply. There is a huge demand for quality, safe, secure foodstuffs in China. Secondly, in the services industries, not just tourism, where now millions of Chinese are travelling around the world, education services, health services, financial services, construction and engineering services, where Australia has world-class services to offer, particularly if we have an effective NBN.
If we can turn to another foreign policy matter, which is the question of asylum seekers coming to Australia by boat, do you agree with your colleague Laurie Ferguson that Labor will be dead if it doesn't start to do more to counter Tony Abbott's line that he will stop the boats?
Well, I won't comment on what Mr Ferguson has said, but what I will say is this. As Mr Abbott approaches this election, he's essentially doing so on the basis of three arguments to the Australian people, and you've just pointed to one of them. On the asylum seekers question, let's just put his proposal in a nutshell. He says he will stop the boats and he will send them back to Indonesia. That is an absolute lie. He knows that. Everyone who knows this area of policy well knows that. It's more of a slogan than a substantive policy position, and the Indonesian government made that clear through their ambassador in the course of the last week or so. The second premise, by the way, for Mr Abbott's election campaign is that he says that this country has a debt and deficit crisis. That also is a lie, because we've got 3 credit ratings agencies around the world who say that Australia, almost uniquely, has a AAA credit rating. It doesn't stack up. And his third premise, and I just need to put this into its context, Mr Abbott is now saying, after 20 years in Parliament, 19 years as one of the most extreme right-wing conservative leaders or politicians that the Liberal Party has thrown up, in his 20th year, he's suddenly become a policy moderate. Well, you can wear, pale blue ties to assuage people up to some point, but a leopard never changes its spots.
Mr Rudd, the Prime Minister's supporters blame you and your supporters for much of Labor's poor standing in the polls because they claim that you've repeatedly undermined the government. What do you say to that?
Well, what I'd say is very simple. That, number one, that is untrue. And number two, my job, like every other Labor member of Parliament, is to get out there and argue the government's case for re-election, to undermine Mr Abbott's untruthful case for election.
Given that you're out there, if the ALP is defeated on the scale that even Labor MPs are anticipating, what will be your share of the blame for that?
Can I just say, it is completely wrong for people in our national political life to be on about constructing alibis for defeat when our responsibility on behalf of the people we represent in the Parliament of Australia is to not just devise a strategy for victory, but to implement that strategy as well. We have a phenomenally strong record on the economy. We, on the basis of our economic record, deserve re-election. You
say that they're strong points for re-election, but the public doesn't seem to be buying it. Have voters stopped listening to Julia Gillard?
Well, you know the great saying in politics that a week is a very long time in politics. Well, let me tell you, 100 days is an eternity. We have an opportunity, all of us, the Prime Minister, ministers of the government, backbenchers such as myself, to argue the case for the Labor Party. Others can provide the commentary as to who is being listened to or not. My job is to put the case for Labor. It's a strong case on its merits, as opposed to one which has been constructed on a tissue of lies, as we have in the case of Mr Abbott's campaign.
Do you commit to serving another full term in the Parliament if you're re-elected?
Of course I do. I don't believe in bringing on unnecessary by-elections.
And a final question. I just want to make sure that nothing has changed in your mind. Is there any scenario in which you would take the leadership of the Labor Party?
Lee, my position on that hasn't changed since February of last year. The caucus had an opportunity to vote then, and they voted 2-1 in favour of the Prime Minister and against me. I've accepted that position. My job is to go and argue the case for Labor, and that's what I'll be doing around the country between now and voting day. It's a good case, and we should not be hauling up the white flag.
So the answer is there's no scenario?
As I said before, my position hasn't changed since February of last year. You know what I said then. I'm not going to enter into word games with you. The caucus voted. I accepted their response.
If you don't say a blank no, people of course interpret it as you leaving wiggle room.
Well, you know exactly what I've said in the past to these questions time and time and time again, and you'll play word games all the way through. Last time I said in February of 2012 that I would not be challenging the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister won that caucus ballot by 2-1. It was a convincing and strong win. I've accepted the result.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much for your time today.
Good to be with you.